This month's Where Did the Road Go is brought to you by 8 amazing people. Greg Ross, Billuminati, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, Michael Fritschke, Yvonne Williams, and Doug Malam. Thank you all so very much for helping make this show possible.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And I have returning to the show. I don't know how long it's been since the last time you were here, but we have Mr. Walter Bosley. Hey, Walter.
Hey, Seriah. It's good to be here again. I always enjoyed talking with you.
I think the last time you were on might have been the show we did on Hecate.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it was, actually.
And because normally you come on for your books, although you've come on for a few other things. And you do have a new book out, which seemed to just kind of appear out of nowhere. I didn't really know you were even working on this.
Yes, it did.
And it's called...
Go ahead.
Oh, it's called Nymza, How America Sold Its Soul.
Exactly. And it was some material that I had originally started to present as kind of a little video documentary intro into something I was going to do on my YouTube channel. And quite frankly, I found the data, the background research to be it was depressing. It was something that it really sunk in, the premise. And so I stopped working on it. It's the only time that I've looked at some dark things, but it's the only time that the material just kind of compelled me to stop. And a few years later, I decided, you know what, I need to get this out there. And so it was kind of a sudden decision, I think about a year ago. And it was just something that I worked on fairly quietly and did. I just kind of sprung it on my audience, and there it is.
And it does tie into a lot of your other books.
Yes, indeed. It ties into the book Origin, the one about the breakaway civilizations, specifically with, of course, the German thread. Of course, the word and the name Nymza we get from Charles Dellschau of the Sonora Areo Club legend, okay, because that's the original source of that word. And through my research on the breakaway civilization book, I kind of put together this, how I see it, right? An hypothesis that this German organization continued on after the Sonora Areo Club days of the 1850s and continued on through the airship mystery era and right up, as the book goes into, the World War II era.
Right. And Nymza, you don't know 100% what that stands for, right?
Right. All we have is Dellschau's spelling of it, all capital words, so we can, kind of guess that it's an acronym, but he never himself ever explained exactly what that word meant or extrapolated it out. So we're really left to just speculate and hypothesize on that based upon the peripheral data, right, in the thread pulling.
Yeah. Can you explain to people who aren't familiar who Dellschau is?
Charles Dellschau was this interesting fellow who, you kind of got to start with how he came to be known to the public. In 1971, a gentleman named Pete Navarro, who he's in Texas, the Houston area, I believe. He liked to go to junk shops and antique stores, and he happened to be at this junk shop, and he saw this book, several books actually, of these very curious and interesting drawings that were really paintings that were very colorful and in most cases very detailed, and they appeared to be some type of contraption or conveyance, specifically flying machines. But they didn't quite look exactly like balloons. They certainly didn't. Well, they didn't look exactly like zeppelins. and they predated, powered flight by decades. Now, Navarro, he had enough money to buy one of the books. He went back and bought more. But what he found out was that Charles Dellschau, the artist and writer of these books and the journal that accompanies it, was a German immigrant who came from Europe, came from Germany on an assignment from this mysterious Nymza group in the 1850s. And he comes to the United States. He's supposed to go to California and observe and report on this group of German immigrants, other German immigrants, called the Sonora Areo Club. And according to Dellschau, this Sonora Areo Club was successfully experimenting with controlled flight in the 1850s, the decade before the U.S. Civil War, which is kind of mind-boggling because, mainstream history tells us we didn't have controlled flight until specifically 1903 with the Wright brothers.
Yeah.
Right? So Dellschau, these books in question, he created these books between the years 1890 and 1923, the year he died. And for many years since the discovery of his works, he died in obscurity. He was a butcher by trade. After he had gone to California, he returned to Texas. He settled in Texas, through which he had migrated. And he became a butcher, a local butcher. And he, had a wife and daughter, and the wife passed away, and he just lived a regular life. And, when he died in obscurity. But when Navarro found these books, he brought attention to them, and they ended up, interestingly, several of the books ended up in a museum founded and owned by the Demonils, which that family is associated, by the way, with the JFK assassination milieu because they have connection to the trademark, the international or global trademark that David Ferry and other individuals connected to the JFK assassination milieu were involved with. And what's weird is that they were interested in these Dellschau books. So they put them in museums, and that kind of brought him into the public awareness, right? But for decades, he was considered just what they call an outsider artist. This was all fantasy, and he was just, one of these unique guys who had an artistic vision and made up stories. Well, the problem is that when you start pulling threads, you find that some of the people that he talked about living in Sonora, California in the 1850s really lived there. You can still find these names in present, current living family members who are in the phone book and live around town, and there's certainly some of them in the cemeteries. And then when you look at what Dellschau, talks about, and you pull threads on that, you find interesting connections to late 19th century airship milieu technology. The biggest one, which I actually put out there publicly first, was that I found in the Dellschau books that Dellschau claims that the device that powered these flying machines in the 1850s, this was, he referred to it as something else, but when you look at the schematics, it looks exactly and works exactly like the Nazi Bell, kind of a prototype, proof of concept version of the Nazi Bell. And now what's crazy about that is Dellschau draws this and explains this prior to 1923, okay? And we don't get stories of the Nazi Bell until, well after World War II. So, on the one hand, if you think that stories of the Nazi Bell are all a hoax and fake, well, shoot, here's this Dellschau guy who talked about it and did drawings and schematics of it before 1923, which would have been before Nazi Germany was working on anything of its kind. So Dellschau, as you pull these threads in with that big one right there, you begin to come away from this conclusion that he was just an outsider artist. You see that he observed somebody doing something with this weird science and technology. And he was likely telling the truth, telling the story as he witnessed it. And then it becomes, really wild because you're talking about controlled flight technology decades before it's supposed to have happened. So that's the background going into the World War II era, from which we are told this Bell technology exists, and these other things that then I go into in the book. So that's Dellschau.
What is the Nazi belt supposed to be? Because I've heard so much different contradictory stuff about this.
Right. Well, some believe that it was an advanced propulsion technology, or at least that was perhaps the original intention of the technology, because in the lore of it, we can't say reports, because are the reports lore, or is the lore reports? We're told in the lore that reportedly a side effect was anti-gravity, or I prefer to say now counter-gravity. So, and the alleged witness stories, you see that they saw the device, tethered to the ground, but it was in the air, with no visible means of propulsion, no rocket exhaust coming out, no propellers. It's just up there. And others say that it was maybe just intended to be some type of super source of energy. We can say that with all three of these things in the mix, it certainly suggests a line of technological pursuit that includes all of these. Sure, it can be the source of the counter-gravity for flight, but it can also be the source to power all systems on, whatever the craft, whatever the object is. And, that's allegedly what the Bell is believed to have been. But there also happens to be some pretty wild assertions that it messed with time and space,
right,
in the local, vernacular. So it was this wonder weapon, as Igor Witkowski, the first author to present to the public this legend of the Bell. That's what he called, the book that it's in, the wonder weapon, Nazi wonder weapon. And it certainly could have been all of those things. And the idea is that it was it, or the knowledge of how to make it was captured, right? During the war, at the end of the war, and that there's reason to suspect that the United States continued research and development of this particular technology. The Kecksburg UFO is often suspected to be the first United States version of the Bell.
Okay, that would make sense. Interesting. Yeah, but is the problem that there's no hard documentation of the Bell, just witness reports?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. There are allusions to a German classification that is translated directly as something along the lines of like what we call a game changer, what they would call war decisive. In other words, if they were able to perfect this particular object, whatever it was, it's not specified in the documents that I'm talking about. It would totally change the outcome of everything, in the war for them. And that's what they classified, some mysterious thing in their wonder weapon category. And that is often it's speculated to have been the Bell.
Okay. Are there also allusions to it using mercury?
There has been an allusion to this mercuric I'm losing the word, serum, is what they would call it. And it was basically physically the Bell is supposed to be, the Nazi Bell is supposed to be two Bell apparatuses, actually one piece inside the other, and they counter rotate. Okay, one goes clockwise, one goes counterclockwise, and in between is pumped this alleged mercury solution. Now, the problem with that specific is the problem with the entire modern Nazi Bell story. and that is that it emerged through very questionable sources. There's a guy named Ernst Zundel who it's known to have originated with him the Haunebu saucer story, via the Haunebu saucer story, which is completely bogus. Ernst Zundel is the guy who first put out the whole Haunebu saucer thing.
Gotcha.
And then there were these two filmmakers who were involved with some a fake file, very questionable photographs and such. And this was being bandied about late 80s, early 90s, according to some sources. And when Igor Witkowski, he got his first tip on the bell from a Polish intelligence officer. Now, there are problems there with that in that we have no way of knowing how straight the Polish intelligence officer was being with, the whole situation. It could have been just something that, he made up, or he knew these movie producers who were dabbling in fake Nazi flying saucer stuff, totally, demonstrated to be fake. But the other problem we have with what Witkowski learned from the Polish intelligence officer is a little novel that came out in the mid-90s titled Lightning by Dean Koontz, okay? And in that book, he has time-traveling Nazis who use a device that is identical to the bell, except in one way. It stands horizontally instead of vertically, okay? and one moves through it to go from one dimension to the other of time, okay? Now, that novel had been around since the mid to late 80s, just like this Zundel and Haunebu material. And so the Polish intelligence officer could easily have simply read that Koontz novel, okay?
Right.
And what he tells Witkowski, is he's just pulling his leg and using, this device in this Dean Koontz novel, which predates the whole thing, the whole meeting between Witkowski and the intelligence officer. So there's a problem there that we have with this fake Haunebu material going around and Dean Koontz novel. But then again, we come back to the little problem of Dellschau. Now, it is possible, you have to acknowledge that it is possible that Koontz learned about Dellschau's description of this bell-like device and saw it in the Daemonil Museum or somewhere else. And he created, from that influence and the rest out of whole cloth, he created this device for his book. And that is, what was twisted into this thing called the bell by the Polish intelligence officer. So, you have to, because those are the facts, you have to acknowledge that, Koontz could have made it up based on exposure to Dellschau. If he didn't have exposure to Dellschau, then you got to wonder, where else could he have gotten the idea? Could someone have told him about this? So you see, it's so hard to pinpoint, right? Because you got Dellschau flat, and I show this in my book, by the way. In fact, in two of my books, Origin, there's an image of Dellschau's drawing prior to 1923 of the bell, and it's in another one of my books. I think might be one of the Empire of the Wheel books, in which I talk about Dellschau. So with all this murkiness, okay, it's hard to say, okay, who's telling the truth? What part is the truth? And then throw Kecksburg in the mix there. There was a bunch of witnesses, and it was bell-shaped. They said acorn, but when you look at the model of the thing and the drawings of the Kecksburg UFO, it's a bell. So it's as I just demonstrated, it's hard to just explain what the bell is in a nutshell, right? Because you have all this, there's so much there.
And the reason I bring up Mercury is because isn't that one of the things that is associated with Vimyanas in the Mahabharata?
Well, not so much the Mahabharata. There is a book. I don't have the title sitting in front of me. It's really hard to pronounce. The Suva. It's the title of the book. It's a double S title. If I had it in front of me, I apologize. I don't. I'm not sitting, near my bookshelf. But this particular book I'm talking about was not written until 1908. And it was not translated into English until 1954. Now, the book talks about the what we call a Mercury vortex engine, right? It talks about it as likely what the ancient Vedic writings talk about. So the Mercury vortex engine itself, though it is not in the Mahabharata, it is not in the ancient Vedic works. In this 1908 book, it is presented as how it could have worked in ancient times.
Okay.
People make the mistake of confusing this 1908 book with the ancient scriptures. Now, here's the interesting thing. Some people would say, well, 1908, that's obviously where Dellschau got it. Well, if Dellschau, a butcher, who migrated as a young man to Texas, if he understood Sanskrit, well, maybe, because the book was in Sanskrit until 1954, this 1908 book talking about Mercury vortex engine. So Dellschau gets it from somewhere else, he claims through observation. So that's out there in the mix, this 1908 book, and it is confusing.
Okay. All right. I just want to hear Mercury. I think of that, and I thought it was actually in the Mahabharata, but obviously not.
No.
It's been a while since I came across that information, too. So, so going back to the book a little bit, one of the things you do is you trace this all the way back to the Teutonic Knights, and this comes from what's called the 1,000-Year Conspiracy from Paul Winkler.
Yes.
You want to get into that a little?
Yeah. Boy, oh boy. I was recommended to. I had been visiting my good friend Joseph Farrell, and I forgot what I asked him the question about. It had to do with Dellschau and Nymza, and then 20th century stuff. And I seemed to express. I guess I expressed a suspicion about the World War II era and Operation Paperclip and stuff. And he kind of paused and he said, "There's a book you need to read." He says, "I have a copy of it, but he goes, you can find it out there online because I only have one copy and I'm hanging on to mine," he said. So it was this 1,000-Year Conspiracy by a gentleman named Paul Winkler. And I go into who he was in my book and everything, but essentially, he wrote this book in 1937, and unfortunately, he does not have footnotes in the book. He does not identify his references. However, what he talks about through the medieval history of Germany, the Prussian states, and then they unified into Germany, as we know, in the 19th century. It really does. It's pretty accurate to the known history. So really, it's not that Winkler's presenting a bunch of stuff that's not true. It's just that he did not help his case or his argument by not offering the basic historic sources. So you're going to have a lot of people that will just dismiss it, just out right off the bat because he doesn't have footnotes. But he goes through and. He basically is arguing that what the Prussian Junker class did to Germany through the medieval era and on up into the post-medieval and on up into the modern times is exactly what Nazi Germany is demonstrating, as they're going into the war. Now, remember, he writes this in 1937. It gets published in 1943, I think. It's 41 or 43. And here's the kicker about it. What he describes this medieval, Prussian Junkers group doing, first with the Teutonic Knights, then with the city-states, then with, the various, Germanic states, the Prussian states in the medieval time, is exactly what he argues somebody's doing, using the Nazis, and that the Nazis intend to do, after the war. And the disturbing thing about it is when you read it with 21st century eyes and knowledge of history, it describes exactly how Operation Paperclip happened and how our military industrial complex came to be. And it's just shocking. And it's predictive because, again, he wrote it in 1937. It gets published in 1943, before any Operation Paperclip, before our military industrial complex becomes the machine, the monster that it is.
Yeah. So the Teutonic Knights, it starts with them then. This whole path that you're talking about.
Yes.
And you threw up a bunch of things. I thought it was Junkers when I was reading your book. You said it's Junkers?
Yeah. Well, that's how I and other sources I know that refer to them, who speak German and stuff, say Junkers.
Now, you also said they were Prussian, but they weren't necessarily specifically associated with a state.
Right. Okay. Here's what they did. This Junker class, they usurped the title Prussian, and they developed their own particular corporate identity, culture. Now, what we call the Prussian culture today, this particular slice of Germans who, are known for their precision and their cold-hearted machine-like, this was something that they created and invented. The corporate identity of it. Now, actual people who lived in what was called Prussia, they weren't these Prussians that we have been aware of today. They were just the people who lived in this area with resources and such that these Junkers wanted. Okay. They ingratiated themselves with the Teutonic Order, and pushed them into, conflicts between the cities and the city-states and territories and things like that. And once geographical Prussia was conquered, this new class started referring to themselves as Prussians and expressing this, what we know as, the Prussian culture. But it was something that they kind of just created, and they were not the original people of the geographical area that was known as Prussia.
Okay.
So what they did was they kind of they invented themselves and did very Machiavellian type of maneuvering to ingratiate themselves into the Teutonic Knight Order as like an administrative support lackey kind of role. But then they started influencing, and then they started essentially their duplicity. They would then secretly ally with the Teutonic Order's enemies, and double cross the Teutonic Order. And ultimately they did literally just that. They double crossed the Teutonic Order, and then they went on to their new host, as it were. They're like a parasite. That's how they work. And they go from one host to another, and they destroy the current host as they're going into the new host. And that's what they did to the Teutonic Knights.
Okay. And you also talk about, and I can't not think of David Icke when you use the name, the Society of Lizards.
Yeah, right. Exactly. A lot of people, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Russian or the German name, term, but it basically translates and is known as the Society of Lizards. And what this was a symbolic image of a very secretive group that to this day, I can't tell you really what they were all about or what their origin was. At most, you can take just a wild guess, which I, attempt to do in the book. But this Society of Lizards, they were at the heart of all this Junker Prussian manipulation of various entities and government and commercial bodies. And they were the ones who pushed for a unified Germany. Between the Society of Lizards and the Junker Prussians, These are the influences that were pushing for a unified Germany. That's what they were really after.
Okay. And I don't know how to pronounce it. FH or FEHME.
I don't know if it's the the FEMA or the FERMA or whatever. They were this like enforcers for the Junker Prussian class. Okay. And they would make their assassinations, their executions very public and often violent to, like we're used to in our times with the mafia and, maybe the intelligence community, when you got to take someone out, make sure you make an impression on the public that, don't fool with certain things. And that was the spirit in which this FEMA worked.
And you think this all eventually became Nymza?
I do think that whoever founded Nymza, whatever it was yes, from this Junkers Prussian class that had emerged during the medieval times. Yes. So I think that's who was behind Nymza. When Dellschau in his writings talks about the Prussian officer, that's how they referred to him, who is sent from the Nymza headquarters in Germany to observe and report also on the Sonora Areo Club, and to also communicate to them that the Home Office would like for them, that Nymza would like for them to design and build military flying machines, which the Sonora Areo Club members were vehemently opposed to. But Dellschau refers to that Prussian officer coming as a representative, the official representative of Nymza. So there we have from Dellschau a big clue that it indeed was one of these Prussian Junker pre-unification type of organizations.
Okay. And,
I make the distinction in a couple of other books that Nymza was very much likely a nationalist organization. And the distinction, remember, between a nationalist organization and a national organization is that a national organization usually refers to something official of a known sovereign nation, right? Nationalist refers to a political position, right? So prior to the unification, your nationalists were the people that would have been pushing for that. And I think that's what Nymza was.
Okay, so as you come in further, well, first of all, also explain what you meant by influence espionage, because you use that term.
Yes. This is where, for instance, in the book, I go into present-day, modern-day lobbyists, okay? Lobbyists use, pretty much influence espionage. So what do I mean by that? They'll do things where they'll meet with their targeted politician, the person who holds the purse strings, say, to a certain budget, and they will play this game where they make it look like a social contact. Okay. They'll try to make it look like something that it's not. And what's really going on is they're maneuvering, around this person, pushing their ego button, maybe, gifting them, material things or whatever. And it's for an ulterior motive, right? The lobbyist will do this on behalf of their industry. Okay. One aerospace company wants to get the contract over the other one. So, the lobbyist, of course, pushes the political target to, vote their way. Okay.
Right.
Now an espionage agent will do much the same thing in the same way. They'll approach the association as something that it's not actually, either a very casual friendship. They'll push the person's ego buttons. They'll gain their trust and be able to, kind of get into their head. And again, it's, so that politician votes their way. It's a subtle game of manipulation and control that has gone on forever. I mean, Machiavelli wrote about this, right, in the medieval era.
Okay, so I'm trying to do this sort of in chronological order.
Yeah.
What you talk about the Civil War and the Lincoln assassination. What is the connection there to Nymza?
Well, I think it's best to read quickly what was said by Bismarck, okay, a well-known German historical figure. And what's interesting is he wrote this. By the way, this is from the book War Debt, The Shocking Truth About Our Money System and How We Can Break Free by Ellen Hodgson Brown, okay? And this is what she reports Bismarck saying. I don't have this was in the 1870s, okay, I believe, or referring to the 1870s. And Bismarck said, I know of absolute certainty that the division of the United States into federations of equal force was decided long before the Civil War by the high financial powers of Europe. These bankers were afraid that the United States, if they remained in one bloc and as one nation, would attain economic and financial independence, which would upset their financial domination over the European financial domination over Europe and the world. Of course, in the inner circle of finance, the voice of the Rothschilds prevailed. They saw an opportunity for prodigious booty if they could substitute two feeble democracies burdened with debt to the financiers in place of a vigorous republic sufficient unto herself. Therefore, they sent their emissaries into the field to exploit the question of slavery and to drive a wedge between the two parts of the Union. The rupture between the North and the South became inevitable. The masters of European finance employed all their forces to bring it about and turn it to their advantage. End quote of the first part there about how basically Bismarck is saying that the European financiers, the banksters, right, the global bankers, that they planned and made our Civil War happen. And then he goes on about Abraham Lincoln, okay? And here's basically in reference to Lincoln issuing his greenback dollars, okay? In rejection of debt to the European bank lords, Bismarck says this, quote, the government and the nation escaped the plots of the foreign financiers, the U.S. government. They understood at once that his quote, I'm sorry, is kind of confusing. The U.S. government and the nation escaped the plots of the foreign financiers. The foreign financiers themselves understood at once that the United States would escape their grip. The death of Lincoln was resolved upon, end quote.
And how did that help them?
Well, it pushed us further along to, embracing, in the early 20th century, we embraced, the Federal Reserve. Okay. It pushed us further along away from having an independent currency. They were pushing us for decades to be locked into their system of currency, which we ultimately were through the Federal Reserve. But Lincoln issuing congressional issued currency, well, that meant that the United States was not under the banksters' control, literally, like Bismarck says. And like when we look back on this, we talk about these global bankers and we know what they're up to. This is exactly what that's referring to, how, even in Lincoln's time. And think about, people often make a lot of interesting connections between Lincoln and Kennedy's situation, right?
Yeah.
Kennedy did a very similar thing with the silver certificates. He bucked the Federal Reserve, right?
Yeah.
And, again, just like with Lincoln, look what happened to him. It's just one of the things he did.
One of many, I think, that upset a lot of people.
Oh yeah.
That would have been all good for us, but not for the powers that be.
Right. Yeah. So, and when you have someone like, Bismarck, well-known figure in German history, pretty much laying it out there on the line. And this wasn't from, remember, I quoted that from a book on international global finance history. Okay, that wasn't from the Winkler book that, has no sources. No,
right.
that was sourced. That's from the Brown book on on financial history. So this is something that he said. And what's interesting when we talk about the Civil War, when we talk about the Lincoln assassination, I had never heard that before.
No, me neither.
What Bismarck said. And until, I was referred to look at these things and start pulling threads. And when you do, this stuff emerges.
There was also, you mentioned something about the Anunnaki. I didn't make a note about what you said about them, though.
Oh, well, this is where the whole thing about the Society of Lizards gets weird. And I try to keep it grounded in that, remember the whole idea of animal and spirit familiars, right, is something we all know. Yeah. Particularly if we're esoteric studies and literature and knowledge, where certain people, families, cultures, groups, would use an animal as their symbol, right? Their representative image. Yeah. For whatever characteristics that animal is known for and how it translates to human behavior and such. So whatever, say, the Anunnaki actually were or could have been, the question is the secret of the Society of Lizards, this big dark secret, which Winkler tells us that they have some dark secret that they guard more than anything else, okay? Was this secret that their line extends way, way back into ancient times where for instance, the Babylon banksters that Joseph Farrell writes about, the Chaldeans, and even before them, could the secret of the Society of Lizards have something to do with this Anunnaki legend? Now, here's what you have. You have the Anunnaki story where they come from another world, they come from the sky and such.
Right.
But then that's also Sitchin. That's what?
That's Sitchin's interpretation.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have this this group, the Anunnaki, who might have just been a people that came from a part of the world that back then, the rest of the world didn't know about, and let's say they, if they were the descendants of one of the lost advanced civilizations. Now, I happen to come from the perspective that, human knowledge, human civilization comes and goes in cycles. And I see no problem with there having been a relatively technologically advanced civilization in the past, and through cataclysm or warfare, what have you, it falls, and then, humankind has to rebuild for the most part. This is an idea that we're all familiar with. Yeah. Well, what if, say, the Anunnaki come from that type of background, okay?
Which is a good possibility.
Yeah. It's a possibility. And, it's possible that this Society of Lizards could be some type of descendant organization from that culture.
Okay.
So, and when you're talking about Nymza, and you're talking about the bell, and you're talking about weird exotic technology, that, don't get me wrong, just because the Mercury Vortex engine thing came, the first source of it is a 1908 book, doesn't mean that kind of thing didn't exist in Vedic times.
Right.
So if these Anunnaki originated in an era where this kind of technology was known to them, who's to say that the whole story of what we call the Nazi bell wasn't something that they were seeding into certain groups to have us, get us to rebuild and return to the prior level of, technological advancement. So that's the reason I bring up the Anunnaki. Is because the
possible lineage.
Yeah, and for instance, there's the people, like you mentioned, David Icke. There's the people that take the whole lizard people thing seriously, literally.
Yeah, literally, okay? Right.
Yeah. Now, the Society of Lizards used the lizard, the reptile, as a symbol reflective of their wily ways. Okay, this is the Paul Winkler interpretation and such. So what if the Society of Lizards was the origin of, stories that Ike has, in my opinion, gone way out into left field with and taken way too literal. This is why I present this, that the Society of Lizards might be the origin, and it was just of this idea, and it was just using symbolism and allegory and euphemism. And, a guy like Ike has taken it literally. These people are not lizards like in the science fiction show V,
right.
But they have possibly a connection, more likely, say, to this Society of Lizards.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So
let's look at the airship thing. So we had the airship wave in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Do you think this was all associated with Nymza?
No. Actually, I think the airship mystery in the 1890s, it was here in the western United States for the most part. I think that was a separate group that had nothing to do with Nymza. And I do lay that out in my book, Origins. I propose that was a group of American airship builders, so to speak, or enthusiasts, and that actually it could have been the legacy of what I suspect, what I propose might have been the, and I know there's a lot of propose and might have beens, but that's what we're dealing with here. That might have been the product of, say, what could have been the what we would call the first black project in U.S. military history. Where do I get that from? There was a guy named Solomon Andrews. Now, this was reported in newspapers of the day. This is a known thing. He contacted Abraham Lincoln. This was during the war, I believe in 1863. And he said, I have a design and a technology, a flying machine. It's not a balloon. It's something that can be controlled. And Abraham Lincoln reportedly was very enthused to learn more about this. So he, according to the reports, directs his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, to observe a demonstration of Solomon Andrews' airship. Well, Andrews apparently demonstrated this flying machine that he could control right there at the mall at the Capitol, what they called the mall. And there were newspaper reporters and there were representatives of the U.S. War Department there. And the story goes that Solomon Andrews is told, thank you, but no thanks. We're in the middle of a war. We don't have time for these flying machines. Well, my problem with that is you're looking for any edge you can get. And in 1863, I don't think the Union was quite confident that they were definitely going to win that war. So it strikes me as odd that Andrews would have been blown off like that. Yeah. I propose that he wasn't completely blown off. I talk about this in Secret Missions 3, Destination Carcosa. This is where I detail it. And I think that due to the war and due to the limited resources and such, they couldn't do much with this flying machine technology during the war. So they set it aside. But after the war, I do think they pursued the development of it in secret. And the one of the big threads there is a guy named Colonel Samuel Tillman, if you look him up. And I talk about him in a couple of books. And by the 1890s, 30 years after our Civil War ends, in the airship mystery of these interesting big contraptions flying around, one of the people reports that a Colonel Samuel Tillman is one of the crew members on the airship in the 1890s. And approaches him and talks to him. Colonel Tillman was a U.S. Army officer. He went on after that to be Commandant of West Point. I think during World War I, he was a well-known historical figure. There's photos of him. And what's interesting is he was a cartographer and a chemist, U.S. Army officer, but a chemist and a cartographer. Now, I go into the book why that is of interest, because a chemist would be very interested in anything like a Mercury vortex engine or anything, using even a liquid fuel or such. So Tillman's got the pedigree, and he's by name involved in the 1890s airship mystery. So these are just two of the threads, that I pulled and present in two or three of my books, arguing that the United States, indeed, after the Civil War, likely pursued development of this technology that Solomon Andrews brought, which for all we know, Andrews might have known members of the Sonora Areo Club. And then 30 years after the secret development, they kind of demonstrate these things just to see what kind of reaction they'll get. But here's what's interesting. The way the 1890s airships are described is there's moving parts and other things that work in the propulsion and the lift and stuff that are nearly identical to what the Sonora Areo Club was doing, okay? Including a bell, rotation and spin and that kind of thing. So this is how I propose the hypothesis that the 1890s airships were a product of the knowledge gained in the 1850s by the Sonora Areo Club and what Solomon Andrews brought to Abraham Lincoln and his War Department in 1863, because the 1890s airships are virtually just the advanced versions of what the Sonora Areo Club was doing 40 years before. And this was all an American thread, because we have Dellschau, and we don't have any other sources pointing out that Nymza was around or involved with any of this, or that there were, these Nymza organization Germans involved with any American pursuit of this technology. I don't know for sure, but that's how I propose it, is that it would have been a rival American group that would have rivaled Nymza. That's my opinion.
Okay. Now, do you think some of those would have been genuine UFO encounters as well, that were maybe mimicking what other people were seeing that were not, that were part of this airship wave?
You're saying otherworldly UFOs mimicking it?
I'm saying the phenomena, whatever it happens to be. I don't particularly think it's extraterrestrial.
I happen to think that what we're dealing with the phenomenon is various UFO phenomena is some secret group that exists here and shares this planet with us. For all we know, that it might have been their technology that was used in Vedic times. It might have been their technology all along that they've been seeding into human civilization. And in these others, they could be humans from other worlds. I don't think that I don't buy the mainstream science conclusion that we're all supposed to swallow, that humans like us in no way could possibly have emerged anywhere else in the universe. I think that's absolutely ridiculous as a conclusion. It's possible but I think I would lean more towards our airships. Whoever was building them, the mystery airships, they were more aware of these other, what we would call UFOs, these other people, than most, the average people were, than the witnesses of the airship mystery were. So it was more like they were trying to mimic what these others were flying.
Gotcha. Now you talk about the possibility that Nymza went to the moon before we did.
What's really interesting is there is this story out there, and it is just a story. It hasn't been corroborated yet, but the legend is that in 1903, an American group went to Nikola Tesla and, they proposed to him what they wanted to do. They wanted him to design an airship that they could build with their resources that they intended to fly to Mars in 1903. Now, what's interesting about that, in any connection to what Nymza might have done, is that you have, decades before that, you have Jules Verne, right, and his writings. And the suspicion that Verne was being seeded and fed certain information to write about that actually involved something that could be done or had been done. Okay. So when you have Verne writing these things and that suspicion that a real group, many people think it was the Angelic Society, but it could have been, another group. When you have that suspected about Verne and you look at the things he was writing, A Trip to the Moon, for example, is one of his novels. And then, after Verne, H.G. Wells, around the turn of the 19th and the 20th century. You have the first Men in the Moon, which is about a professor, Cavor, who creates a stuff called Cavorite, which really makes this spacecraft weightless. And that's how his characters go to the moon, and on and so forth. You have other lore going around. It really makes me wonder, might Nymza themselves have attempted a journey off the planet? And did they succeed? I talk about in Origin this technology, gravito-electro-magnetics, which a guy named Oliver Heaviside developed, and he published his theory about this gravito-electromagnetics, GEM or GEM, it's called, and he published this in 1893. Okay, 1893, and in this, with GEM, one could create a force field around an object, or say a craft of some sort, a skyship, that would have been a life support system.
Okay.
It would have kept whatever's inside the force field protected from things like, say, the Van Allen belts, or things like, a vacuum atmosphere with no air. In other words, if you could create your life support system, you could protect it and the ship and the people aboard the ship with Oliver Heaviside's theoretical, technology. Now, when you have a guy like him publishing that kind of stuff, and he's taken seriously, by the way, even to this day, when you have a guy like him, publishing this stuff that I just described, 10 years before, we are told, the people come to Tesla to get him to build an airship that they can fly to Mars, sounds to me like somebody was taking Heaviside seriously.
Yeah.
And, so Heaviside's just who we know about that was thinking about this and published this, okay? Did the Nymza folks, did some other group, did they know about what Heaviside writes about? And my gosh, could they have used this technology and gone to the moon?
All right, we have to take a quick break. We'll be right back. All right, quick mid-show break here. Contact info and a recommendation. So if you want to contact Where Did the Road Go, it's wheredidtheroadgo.com. Everything's there. You can click on all of our social media linked up. Patreon, if you want to become a Patreon, it's only $3 a month. You get extra content every week, shows a week early, and extra bonus stuff as well. If you have a story you want to submit for a listener's story show, stories at wheredidtheroadgo.com is the email to use. You can also contact me on social media. There's even a pop-up on the website that allows you to talk right to me. All right. Also, if you're into heavy music, I do another radio show called The Last Exit for the Lost, and you can find that at www.thelastexit.org. All right. As for a recommendation, it's a podcast I started listening to this week, Celeritas. Celeritas? Celeritas. I forget how they say it. Celeritas, maybe. And it's a sci-fi podcast, and the episodes are a little bit short, which is a little disappointing. Near the end, they're getting a little bit longer. As of right now, they have 11 episodes, and, oh, wow, that's a jump. I didn't realize that the Season 1, Episode 10 came out in July of 23, and Episode 11 came out in February. So that's weird. I figured 10 was going to be the last one. It's a very cool story. Very, keeps you guessing the whole way through. It's by Magnesium Film. And, I definitely recommend it if you like kind of mysterious sci-fi, I guess you could say. Like, you don't know exactly what's going on, and it keeps kind of, shifting around you a little bit. So, and very, very well done, well produced. So that's my recommendation for this week. And now, back to the show. So I am here with Walter Bosley, and we're talking about his latest book, which is called, it's just called Nymza, with the subtitle of How America Sold Its Soul. And one of the comments you make in the book is that people have pointed out as a criticism of the airship theory that there were no airships in World War I. And what do you make of that?
Well, that's the gap that I acknowledge in my book Origin. I've acknowledged it in other books, and I acknowledge it even to this day. If this group that emerged, according to this legend, in 1903, if they were behind the mystery airships of the 1890s, or let's say they were the industrialists contracted to the U.S. government, if it was a government project, if they're the folks who were doing that, and then they decided to do this next spectacular thing and go off planet, that implies that they were really confident with their airship technology, right? They would have been really confident with an application, say, of Heavisides, GEM. So if this kind of stuff actually was going on, you think we would have seen it during World War I, when, such things were at stake. And not just that, when you're talking about this German group, Nymza, okay? German unification was what, these Prussian nationalists had always wanted. So they finally get it. They get into the 21st century. They end up in a war, what we would call the First World War. It seems like that this unified Germany that they had always wanted, it seems like that this Nymza group themselves would have deployed their amazing airships that they had been, involved with developing for almost a century. But yet we don't see that. We see biplanes. We see, dirigibles, which are not, they are not the airships that we're talking about. So the big question, honestly, is, hey, if all this stuff is true, this 19th century mystery airship stuff going on, how come we didn't see it in World War I? How come we didn't see an emergence of weird wonder technology until World War II? And it is admittedly a gap, because it would make more sense that they would have used this to dominate, but yet they didn't. So that is a problem with the hypothesis, definitely.
Okay, all right. Let's see here. We're not going to get it all into this show. We'll have to finish it up in the Patreon, but let's jump forwards a little bit. We mentioned Project Paperclip, and I think most people probably know what that was, with bringing German scientists into the U.S. to work on science projects. They did the same thing with some of the Japanese scientists as well. And that leads us into things like probably Roswell and MK Ultra and things like that.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, what's your theory on Roswell?
My personal theory on Roswell, which I lay out in detail in my book Shimmering Light, which we've talked about before, is that what Roswell actually was America's first attempt at manned spaceflight. And I argue that because we had our paperclip German, rocket scientists, and most importantly, aviation medicine scientists. A lot of people don't know that Operation Paperclip, that was primarily pitched by and created for America, getting their hands on. It was pitched by German aerospace medicine specialists of the Luftwaffe, and that was the primary reason we did Operation Paperclip. Now, who are these aviation medicine guys? These are the guys who were the early pioneers of life support systems as we know it. These were the guys with the vision of putting man in space. So we had those Germans, right? They had secrecy because they were out back then. Nobody was around Trinity except military people and scientists and stuff. So you put them together with the rocket engineers and, more importantly, the aerospace engineers designing craft other than just rockets, okay? And you give them the Cold War era, post-war money, right? And you put that all together, and what you got are a bunch of guys, you throw them all together, a bunch of guys who, since they were boys, had dreamed of putting man in space. What do you think they're going to do? And it's the Cold War, so they have to do everything in secrecy.
Right.
I argue that they launched a craft, put it into space, however briefly, and on its return is when things went wrong and they crashed. Now, because it was the Cold War, and back then the level of paranoia was high, it was pinging, right? They were willing to let people think it was anything but our Army Air Force still back then, putting man in space, because let people think it's aliens. Let people think it's, gnomes from Venus, whatever, anything but we put man in space, because that would be something that we'd want to keep close to vest. And even though it ended disastrously with the crash, what they gleaned from that led to a much more intensified pursuit of putting man in space by the subsequently established U.S. Air Force. A lot of people don't know the history of the Air Force. Through the 1950s, a big chunk of the Air Force was dedicated to creating our manned space program. And the Mercury program of the book and the movie and the TV series, The Right Stuff, the black capsule, the guys in the silver suits, we've seen it, in TV and movies. This was an Air Force program before NASA even existed. The Air Force program created that capsule and those suits. And it wasn't until October of 1958 that NASA was even created, and the public is told that it was all handed over to them. Well, here's the thing. When you look at the history of that, what the Air Force pursued as far as manned spaceflight in the 50s, and you look at the aircraft that was being developed in the late 40s, it begins to make more sense that Roswell was something from that world, the world of secret technology development in the early Cold War, than the popular ET assumption. And, a lot of times the reason people will reject hypotheses like mine is because they're still believing alleged testimony about Roswell being an ET thing, which 20 years ago was proven to be hoax and false and, made up. But the ET hypothesis lobby, they represent people who are making money on that hypothesis, and they really guard their territory viciously in some cases. Yeah. So that,
and I mean, the disclosure stuff is like the sort of bigger build of all of that stuff that's been building the last 50 years or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I mean, it's clearly an effort to not only cover, I suspect not only cover black projects and stuff, but also just kind of like control the narrative and make money at it.
Yeah. And then you have, this in recent years, this questioning the historical narrative. There are some people that have just taken that to, quite frankly, an irrational degree, case in point. A lot of the things that the Tartaria enthusiasts put out there, the things that are clearly documented to be otherwise. And, this is the trend now.
This is the hidden civilization that they're claiming that existed.
Well, yeah. And it's not that there aren't lost civilizations. I just said several minutes back that, I'm talking about that too. And I think there were these lost advanced civilizations, but we're talking about to the degree that, things that we know how they were built 100 or 150 years ago, just the flat out, no, that's not true. That's all fake. It's lies. Just the, and it's irrational. It's the same irrationality that often goes into a lot of the "we didn't go to the moon" argument. There is this line of irrationality that gets crossed. And, so when I invoke, look at the history, in 1947, look at the history for context, well, the argument will be, well, that's all lies anyway, because all history, is a lie. And there you go. You can't argue, you can't debate, you can't even discuss with thinking like that.
Right. Well, history is always written by the victors.
Yeah, but that's the spin. There's certainly eventual, things having to do with the events still these events happened,
right. And you could see the stuff on the moon from the lunar landing. So what's, how can you, I don't understand that argument. Like, I totally could understand, for example, having, film a moon landing in case things went wrong, or to hide technology from the Soviets or something like that, and using part real footage and part pre-filmed footage. That would be a reasonable thing to have done.
But that's reasonable that we didn't. Then we didn't go. I've long suspected we the public have to this day never been told everything that those astronauts saw while up on the moon, or everything that they encountered. We have not been told everything that's up there. Of course not.
Why do you think that?
Because of some of the weird behavior of the astronauts when they returned, stuff that has been legitimately, documented and discussed. The Apollo 11 astronauts, they get back and there's this press conference and they're all just like kind of out of it. I know. And this is well after their quarantine period. They're back, they're reacclimated. It has nothing to do with that. I find it odd that Neil Armstrong is supposed to have been the first human being to set foot on the moon. And he's so aw shucks humble that he just doesn't become a recluse, but doesn't participate in every once in a while being paraded out as the first man on the moon. I suspect that because he wasn't is why he was that. I think here's what I think. I've said this before, not in this Nymza book. I don't want to confuse people, but in previous books, my suspicion is that in true U.S., particularly military, expeditionary fashion, technology fashion, we try things to make sure they work before we reveal them publicly. And I have no problem with the possibility that we actually did a manned moon landing classified to make damn sure it could work before Apollo 11. Because think about it. Apollo 11, the whole world was watching. It was the height of the Cold War. That was the biggest dog and pony show in human history, known human history. And we're actually going to be doing it for the first time under those circumstances. I don't buy it. I think the real first Americans on the moon, we don't know their names. Or if we know their names, the mission was kept secret.
Right.
Or maybe it was the same three guys. They did it, secretly, and then they did it, publicly, but this could explain, some of the dodginess or the odd behavior. But then there were other things. For instance, who was it? I think it was Seriah, or one of the Apollo astronauts talked about when it might have been Buzz Aldrin, where they would get nauseous when asked certain things or asked to talk about certain things, like what they saw on the moon. What was it they encountered? What's going on up there? I don't think we've been told ever. The public been told the whole 100% true story of what they saw on the moon. Now, the proof is in the pudding. We can put this to the test because increasingly other countries are sending their moon landers up there, right? Yeah. India has done it. China has done it. I think Japan, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So, how soon is it going to be before they start going up to the same areas we went to, and maybe they'll show the stuff that Apollo didn't show? Or are they forbidden to go to those sites? I've heard stories about that too. That they're forbidden to land on those sites. Well, gosh, you would think to put the questions at rest, they would say, "Oh yeah, please, China, India, Japan, France, go up there and land in Tranquility Base so that everybody can see our stuff is there."
Yeah. Well, that's always been my thing with Cydonia. You have something that looks like a face and looks like structures, and NASA's not interested.
Right.
and it's like, okay, if there's even a 1% chance that those are actual structures, that's worth sending getting better pictures, sending a probe there, etc. Instead, they just ignored it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's worth a dedicated mission and not some milquetoast flyover like they attempted to pass off to us. No, that's worth a dedicated landing because, gosh, golly, wasn't NASA supposed to be all about, looking among many things, looking for life? You would think, but there you go.
Yeah, because the close-up, high-resolution picture, as Hoagland showed, was run through a ton of filters.
Yeah.
And they refused to release the raw data. It was shot at a weird angle. Yeah. And that's the thing. They refused to release the raw data. It's like, why are you refusing? Do you want this to be a conspiracy, or are you actually hiding something?
Right.
Because,
Right.
I mean, that's always a possibility, too, that they want it to be a conspiracy.
Sure. Yeah. And to maybe mask, something else.
Right.
So now, if you ask, what does Nymza have to do with all of this? Well, as I point out in the book, this mysterious Nymza group, okay, I argue and present why I think that Nymza was the corporate culture behind the rise of Nazi Germany. Okay. Mm-hmm. And they used the Nazi party and the Nazi apparatus exactly how the Prussian Junkers used the Teutonic Knights. Do not get me wrong. This does not make sympathetic characters out of the Nazis.
No.
This is the devil using a demon. Okay. There's nothing sympathetic about Nazi Germany and the Nazis. But Nymza, the corporate culture, I believe, was behind the rise of Nazi Germany to use them just like the Prussian Junkers used the Teutonic Knights, who were also a group of jerks, by the way.
Right.
They weren't sympathetic either, but they were used. And so the next host at the end of the war was identified, and that was the United States. And I propose that Nymza was behind or had a hand in these Luftwaffe scientists proposing to the United States, hey, why don't you take a bunch of us? I can get 90 more scientists and we'll work for you. This is right out of the Prussian Junkers playbook that Paul Winkler writes about in his 1937 book. So he predicts Operation Paperclip. And it is my argument in the Nymza book that Nymza, through the Nazi scientists, through Operation Paperclip, they invaded the new host. They invaded the United States, because of and they're the ones who built up the hype about the Cold War, made the hype worse than it needed to be. And they're the ones who were behind the buildup and creation of our modern military industrial complex. And that includes our space program. That includes NASA. Okay. So Nymza, through the scientists, technicians, and engineers, the German ones involved with the buildup of all that I just described, Nymza has been right at the heart of the American space program and space technology development all along.
And that include they're also knee deep in things like MK Ultra and mind control and stuff like that as well.
Oh, of course, absolutely. They are, and I argue, and this is the dark part of my book. I argue that they invaded us through Operation Paperclip, using it like a Trojan horse. We're your friends. And the coup d'etat, I'm in that camp that agrees that the coup d'etat that gave them effective control of the United States was the assassination of JFK.
Absolutely.
And since then, they have controlled our politicians. They have controlled the country through the military-industrial complex and finance, the usual culprits. And we really are today a captive host of a parasitic organization that they pull all the political strings. And as you know, a fair portion of the book, I even identify sitting U.S. congressmen who would be the likely targets and puppets of corporate culture, Nymza, running the country today.
And I mean, I've said for a long time that the Nazis didn't lose the war. Germany lost the war.
Yes,
the Nazis kind of won the war because they just emigrated out into, us and Russia and Argentina and stuff like that.
Yeah. The idea is a lot of people credit Hammer Schacht in the 20th century with this idea of German industry leaving Germany proper and using the resources of other nations, and while they're digging their claws into those nations to make them puppets or influence them in some way. Well, Schacht got this from the Prussian Junkers, who did the same exact thing and came up with this idea during the medieval era. It goes back to a big important document people have to realize is the Bull of Rimini.
Yeah.
Okay. The Bull of Rimini was issued by the Emperor and the Pope, and basically it gave the Teutonic Knights an open charter. It kept it vague. And it's this open charter that they had the moral the moral mission. What's the word I'm looking for? The moral right to conquer the world.
Yeah.
Okay. And Paul Winkler in his book presents that as something that even the Nazis that they used the knowledge of the Bull of Rimini to justify their attempt at world domination. And this is something that emerged during the Prussian Junker era of this medieval era that I'm talking about, and it was drafted to serve the aims of this Prussian Junkers group, which I think became essentially behind and in what we call Nymza.
Right. And
it's the Bull of Rimini that they still act upon even to this day. And in their opinion, they're just following what an emperor, and a pope said they could do.
Right. Well, we're out of time. You mind sticking around for a Patreon so I can ask you a few other things?
Sure, no problem.
All right. So the book is Nymza, How America Sold Its Soul. You, I believe, are Walter Bosley.
Yes, I am.
Where can people get the book?
The book can be found at walterbosley.com, which takes you to the links to my I print and distribute through lulu.com, print on demand. It's worth the wait. But you can find all that at walterbosley.com. Just go there and you'll be able to find the book.
And that also links to your YouTube and everything?
Yes, I believe there are links to my Walter Bosley channel at YouTube.
And anything else people should know?
I think that's it. The books, the YouTube channel, and anything else they can learn from there.
All right. Thank you, Walter.
Thank you.
I'm going to take a moment here to thank all of my Patreons. It is because of you that this show is made possible. And I want to give a special shout out to those of you pledging $10 or more. Greg Ross, Illuminati, Madeleine J, Matt in Delaware, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, Tim, Andrew Nichols, Matthew Sproul, Midnight Review presents Christine, a blue second-gen MR2 drifting around a Japanese mountain. Patricia Quinta, Alex Whitcomb, American Rambler, Andrew Maines, Andrew Malone, Ann Witowski, Barbara Fisher, Beverly Williamson, Big Boy Limina, Bright Rectangle, Charles Davis, Charles in Florida, Land of the Crazy and Communicable, CJ, Craig Parmenter, Daniel, Diane B, MTK, Eric Citron, Eric Todd, History and Coffee, J Otto Bullitt, Jack Huntington, James Lindsay, Jim and Sophie, John Mattingly, John Bracken, John Hooling, Carla Mahoney, Kevin Schreck, Cool Kitty, Kristen L, Laser Printer Jam, Lauren McLean, Linda, Linz Jackson K, MJ Armstrong, Mark Brady, Mr. Weird, Oli Andre Olar, Paul Jeffries, Perry Peters, Philosopher of Mirrors, Riker and Stark, Ron Dupre, Sam Sharon, Sarah Horgan, Schmooples, Devourer of Mortal Souls, Stacy Sherwood, Stevie Norman, Strange Stories with the Seeker and Skeptic podcast, Tactical Therapist, Taylor Bell, the Esoteric Book Club podcast, Thunderboy, Tyler H. Glimstead, Varosh K., Victoria, Vincent Trewell, Will Gebhard, Will Powell, Ren Collier, Annabelle Smith, Caroline Walker, TDT Skunkworks, Colin Karras, and Craig Sagastumi. Thank you all so very much for the support. All right, there is a decently long Patreon with Walter included with this show to those of you who are Patreons. You will get that soon. If you want to become a patron, it's only $3 a month, and you get extra content for every show pretty much. And the show's a week early and extra stuff mixed in as well. And you can do that by going to wheredidtheroadgo.com and clicking on the big Patreon link. It definitely helps us out a lot. All right. I do want to welcome a new Patreon this week, Dave Baxter. So I hope you enjoy the extra stuff. There's some cool stuff we'll be putting out soon. We, myself, Chris Ernst, and Saxon went to the Seth House and had a fairly lengthy conversation with the two people who are restoring it. Oshara, who has been there a while doing it, and Amy, who's new, and I'm going to have them both on to talk about their own personal experiences at some point. But it was an interesting trip. It was the first time Saxon and Chris got to meet in person after being on like 100 shows together, and it was a really good time. It's definitely a worthwhile project that they're restoring this place. It looks beautiful inside. We'll be putting up video and pictures soon. So that's upcoming for people who wanted more Seth. There's definitely going to be more Seth. Also, I believe next week I'm going to be running the interview with Robert Guffey that I just did. That was absolutely fantastic. He's the author of Camelio as well as a bunch of other stuff. And so you got that coming up as well. And I still have some other stuff from almost a year ago that I have not gotten time to edit. And I hope to get that stuff up as well. See you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.